Hello, everyone. My name is George. I'm the managing director at Minusia, and I would like to thank you in yet another webinar by Minusia. Last one was with Joel Kletke from Case Study Buddy, and we discussed everything around, or as many things as you can possibly discuss in 1 hour around case studies. And today we have Jakub with us. Jakub is the co-founder and CMO of Speak on Podcasts, which is a leading podcast booking agency for B2B brands and individuals. With more than 2,500 podcast interviews booked, he often talks about leveraging podcast interviews to build unignorable B2B brands. Jakub's passion is to share his knowledge and expertise on how brands and individuals can leverage this unique channel to become known, liked, and trusted by their perfect audience. When he's not working, he usually spends time with his loved ones, working out or playing metalcore music on the guitar, which is quite interesting. Jakub, welcome.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. This is super exciting, and thanks a lot for that great intro.
So I will, pass it over to you. But before I do, I just want to preface that by saying that at Minusia we have done a lot of work, and we've tried a lot to get ourselves booked, get ourselves booked on podcasts, and get me primarily behind the mic. And I can say that it's a real pain. It's very difficult, and so I'm personally interested in knowing how working with someone like Speak on Podcasts can make the whole process easier. But of course, let's start with the process and how you can think and approach speaking on podcasts and how this can be helpful for your company. So the stage is yours, and I will just mute myself and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And I will now start sharing my screen. All right. So during this webinar, we'll be talking about how to win customers by speaking on podcasts. And I would like to start with a quick interaction. And I would like to ask you a question. So please comment 1 if you regularly listen to podcasts. If you tune in to podcasts at least once a month, or maybe a couple times a month, to listen, to learn, to educate yourself, to get inspired. I already see some ones. That's great. And I will now continue to the second question, which is comment 2 if you're using podcasts in your strategy. So whether you're building your personal brand, or whether you're building a brand for your company. Now, what we usually see when we comment, when we ask this question, is that there is a discrepancy between the number of between the people who wrote the number 1 and people who wrote the number 2. Because usually people listen to podcasts, but not so many of them actually use them as a marketing channel. And in fact, in January 2023, there were 5 million podcasts with more than 70 million episodes. So this is a great opportunity. There are tons of people who are listening to podcasts, and you can find your very little unique niche where you can reach your customers. But as I mentioned, most people ignore this as a channel. And in the next 45 minutes, we will actually change it. We will share some strategies on how you can leverage podcast appearances to attract your ideal customers. So here's a brief agenda. By the way, you can see the Q&A here at the end, but feel free to ask questions throughout the entire webinar. And I think George or Zach will be, monitoring the chat. So then I can answer all the questions. And if there are no questions, George, then we can talk specifically about your approach and why you think it didn't work. So in the next 45 minutes, we'll talk about what is podcast guesting, 3 requirements for using this strategy in your business, how to find and pitch the most relevant podcasts. And I will also share some specific examples from what we're doing. I will share the email that I received when I was running a podcast. And lastly, I will share top 3 ways to win more customers using this strategy. So a little bit about me. My name is Jakub. I'm co-founder and CMO at Speaking Podcast. We started this agency in May 2020 with the goal to help B2B brands and individuals to reach their ideal customers through booking them on podcasts. And since then, we booked more than 2,500 podcast interviews. We work with more than 150 speakers on 120 campaigns. And we work with some interesting B2B names such as Gong, Toggle, Paddle. Now we actually finished a campaign for Canva, which was super exciting. And I'll be basically sharing everything I've learned, throughout this journey for you to apply it in your business as well. So let's dive into it. How to win more customers by speaking on podcasts. So first of all, we need to, define what podcast guesting is. And podcast guesting is a new strategy, quite new strategy, compared to SEO. Like this is much newer strategy that not so many B2B brands are using. And it is a strategy that allows you to reach relevant customers by appearing on podcasts they already know, like, and trust. And you appear on them as a guest. To give you a specific example, let's say that you are an agency owner and you want to reach B2B SaaS marketers. So you would use podcast appearances in a way that you would define podcasts that these B2B SaaS marketers listen to. And you would pitch them your topic that would get a lot of interest from the hosts. And then you would appear as a guest on their show. Hopefully, if the host likes the topic. And then it will lead to more brand awareness, content, leads, and so on. We'll be talking specifically about the things that you can achieve by speaking on podcasts a little bit later. It's important to mention that this is actually not a performance marketing channel. So compared to Facebook ads or LinkedIn ads, this is not as predictable as these two channels. And you also cannot be so granular with your targeting. So let's say that you want to reach B2B marketers in New York. It will be very difficult to find podcasts that target only B2B marketers in New York. So you need to go a little bit broader. You need to find B2B marketing podcasts. And it's also not as predictable as Facebook ads or Google ads. But there are some unignorable benefits. And there are three. So first, you build trust and awareness at scale. Second, you network with well-connected podcast hosts. And you generate hours of long-form podcast content. And I'll be breaking down each strategy a little bit later in this webinar. So you can drop the number of each of this benefit. Which one is the most important to you? So is it number one, building trust and awareness at scale? Number two, networking with well-connected podcast hosts? Or number three, generating hours of long-form podcast content? Just drop the number into the comment section, please. And let's move on. And all of these three, all of these benefits will lead to more revenue opportunities for your business. And to share some success stories, here's a proof from some of our customers. So HR consultant for Series B brands sold 50% of his cohort just with podcast guesting, and the price to join his cohort is $10,000. Content creation, we work with the MSP company and with CEOs and with the CEO and other speakers, and they created hundreds of short-form pieces of content for LinkedIn. And also, e-commerce SaaS platform CEO closed a huge deal. I think it was $60K after partnering with podcast hosts. And there are a lot of different success stories that I can share at the end if you want. So first of all, is your business ready to leverage this strategy? And there are actually three requirements. So first, requirement number one is the goal. So you need to have realistic expectations about what and when can be achieved with podcast guesting. So good approach is when you want to network with hosts, if you want to create a lot of content, and if you want to increase your brand trust. The bad goal is that you want to generate hundreds of leads after each episode. So we work usually with different kinds of customers, and during the discovery phase, they mention multiple goals, and there are usually two most common goals. One is brand awareness, and second is lead generation. And what we usually say is that lead gen, it shouldn't be your main lead gen channel, but appearing on podcasts will definitely support all of your existing channels because it will increase that trust. So if you don't have any other lead generation channels established, I wouldn't recommend relying solely on podcast guesting, simply because it takes a lot of time and it is not the main purpose. Requirement number 2, the offer. So you need to have the proven messaging and an offer that resonates with your target audience. So ideally, you should already have clients and they should already have some results. What's not a good approach is that, you don't even know if some people actually need what you're selling. Now, there's no clear revenue threshold. It's not that I would be able to say that if you're making at least $10,000 a month or $1 million annually or more, you're ready for podcast guesting. It's not really the case. If you're an individual and you're already making 10K a month, appearing on podcast, to elevate your brand and to create content might be a good idea. But if you're a SaaS brand and you're barely breaking even, then again, there are probably more pressing things that you should be focusing on to get that revenue up and actually validate the offer and start selling a little bit more. So let's move on to requirement number 3, the audience. So your audience must be broad enough. So there are enough podcasts, but also niche targeted. So ideally, you should be, defining your audience that you want to reach VP of sales, or for example, sales podcasts. And what's not the best approach is when you say everyone, I can talk to everyone, or that you want to talk specifically to barbers in New York City. It will be very difficult to find enough podcasts that would be relevant for, this very niche target audience. And also, if you just say everyone, then it's very hard to identify the right podcast because that's not really the target audience. To give you another example, again, B2B SaaS example. If you want to reach B2B SaaS marketers, you can either reach out to B2B SaaS podcasts, and that will obviously help you reach some marketers, but there will be also other people who are not in the marketing department. Or you can reach out to marketing podcasts, but there is a chance that there will be people who are not in B2B SaaS. So it's always, finding that ideal middle ground. So just a quick recap. Use this strategy for brand building, networking, and creating content. Leads should be the secondary goal. Use this strategy only if you have proven offer, and ideally some case studies as well. And use this strategy only if you clearly know who you want to target. So let's now move to actually the part that is the most exciting, something that I enjoy really a lot, which is how to find and pitch the most relevant podcasts in your industry. So for most B2B speakers, it's better to speak to 100 super relevant people than 100,000 people who don't care. And I actually want to share, a case study with of one of our customers. And he is a marketing coach for executives in 9-figure brands. So very niche. And there are not, so many podcasts that these executives listen to. But if he would decide that he wants to measure the success of his campaign based on, okay, if only 1,000 people listen to this episode, then I will do it, it wouldn't be so wise. Why? Well, because he really doesn't need to reach 1,000 people. All he needs to do is reach 10 people, 50 people, 70, 100 people who are in his ideal audience. Because one deal for him is 5 or 6 figures. So it's important for him to speak to relevant potential customers. Now, the story is different if you are in B2C. If you're selling a supplement, then the volume might be the right option. But for most our customers, most of them are actually from B2B. we always lead with relevancy over volume. So we identify the most relevant podcasts. And if, there are only, 20 podcasts that, each 100 people listen to, but if these 100 people are correct, we reach out to them and we get the booking. And here is our, 4-step process on how we find these podcasts. And this is something that we usually don't share so publicly, but feel free to, use this in your business. So first step is targeting. And this is very actionable, so you need to list 10 keywords relevant to your audience. So we already talked about that, and this is very tactical, so just change the gear in your brain into listening to actually thinking specifically about your business. So audience, let's say that, again, you want to reach B2B marketers and you want to define terms, influencers, and brands. So term that is relevant for B2B marketers is, for example, demand generation. Or, B2B marketing, obviously. Influencers, Chris Walker, Pete Lyja, Jason Vanna. And brands, Demand Base, Refine Labs, Chili Piper. And you want to, come up with, at least 10 relevant keywords, ideally evenly split between these 3 categories. Then you find the podcast, and you do it by searching these keywords, ideally in quotes, on listennotes.com. So here I searched for Pete Lyja, and it gave me, episode that he was interviewed on. So if I'm a B2B marketer and I know that Pete is an influencer in the B2B marketing space, there's a big chance that he will be guest on other B2B marketing podcasts. So, do this for all of your keywords, and you will get a very good and curated list of relevant shows. So that's how you find the right podcast. Obviously, then you need to find the contact details of the host. But if you're using LinkedIn or if you know some basic prospecting strategies, you'll be able to do it. Step number 3 is to identify your topics. So come up with 3 to 4 different topics that are relevant to you and to your audience. So here are some of the topics for our campaigns. So you can always see that they can either be about your expertise or maybe some controversial opinion, or maybe you have a unique process. So if I would be trying to get myself booked on podcasts, I could maybe share, 4-step process for finding the right podcast and getting booked onto them as a guest. That might be one of my topics. Or you can maybe mention something that is about to change in 2024. But always keep in mind 2 things. First, these topics must be relevant to the audience that you're reaching out to. So if you're reaching out to B2B marketers, just make sure that this topic is actually relevant to B2B marketers. Now, I'm sure that you can do a lot of things. You can talk about tons of different things, but you need to make sure that this topic is actually relevant to the audience. And second, you can talk also about your story. Stories are interesting. Some podcasts are all really about stories only, of entrepreneurs. But for most B2B podcasts, they want to hear tactics and they want to hear strategies and what's changing. And usually story is almost like a talking point within some other topic. And finally, the last step number 4, is the actual outreach. So make it about the audience and follow up. And don't make it about you and, just send one email. It will never work if you just talk about yourself and you never follow up. So to share how we do it, always lead with relevancy over personalization. The one thing podcast hosts want, they want to record an amazing episode. And your job, if you're reaching out to them, is to make sure that they understand it from your email, that you will help them to record an amazing episode in as little and as few words as possible. So for that reason, you need to lead with relevancy and then actually personalization and credibility. So let's break it down a little bit more. So you found that podcast, B2B marketing podcast. What you want to do is that you want to listen to, an episode or 2. Just make sure that you are relevant for that podcast. And when you're crafting that email, mention that you listen to this podcast, mention something specific, and I will show the example on the next page. and then talk about what value you can bring onto the show, and then talk about actually who you are and what awards have you won and so on. Podcasters don't really care about if you are, Forbes 30 under 30, as long as you're not relevant to their show. So always make it about them, make it about their audience, and then they'll be interested in you as well. So lead with relevancy, then with your credibility. So this is actually an email I received from podcast booking agency. And funny thing is that I received it after I stopped producing my podcast, maybe like 1 year after I stopped producing my podcast. And it shows how little research most people do before they reach out. So take a moment to read this. There'll be a replay available, so you can stop it and read it. But here, first, my podcast is not active for almost 2 years. Okay, so it was 2 years. Zero research about my ideal listener or my focus. It's all about them, nothing about me or my audience. Call to action is not clear at all. This is the call to action. Looking forward to serving you and dear listeners. We'd be honored to partner with you and explore. I don't know what to do after reading this email. And 3 suggested topics create too much friction, as I need to do all the thinking. This is what most people do. They suggest a number of different topics in the first email. They basically tell the host, hey, here are the topics, you decide. But if you're reaching out to hosts, you need to do the research, so you propose the best possible topic. Without that, your reply rates will be low. And also don't ask for an interview right after, right in the first email. There's so many different things that need to happen before the host, says yes to your request. So make the call to action a little bit softer. So I actually rewrote the email. So as you can see here, I lead that I actually enjoy the episode with the specific guest. I mentioned something specific from the episode. And then, I share why I'm relevant and why my story would be relevant to their podcast and how it actually connects to the episode that I just described. Then, I'm using this uncertain language that actually works really well in cold email, especially in 2023 and 24. And I have, very, soft call to action, which would be open to learning more about blah, blah, blah as a potential guest on your show. It's very easy, yes. I'm not asking them to interview me. I'm not asking anything, that they would, need to do something right after this. They just say yes. And then I take a next step. I share a little bit more information about myself or about my guest. And I keep the, sign off a little bit, casual. So this is actually one of the most important things on this webinar, because podcast host outreach is very difficult thing to master. And writing an email like this actually takes around 30 to 45 minutes with all the research. But if you invest enough time into doing this, it will lead to results. It will work much better than reaching out to hundreds of podcast hosts and hoping that 10% will get back to you and 1% will actually accept you. So just spend time crafting the email pitches. All right. So this was the 4-step strategy. So really quickly, step number 1, targeting. So find the relevant keywords and find these, search these keywords on listen notes to find the right podcasts. Identify the topics that are relevant. And lastly, do the outreach and do it the right way. I will talk about, the exciting part, how to actually monetize your podcast appearances and achieve higher ROI. So there are 3 proven methods. Method number 1, podcast listeners. So you can turn podcast listeners into subscribers, brand evangelists, or customers. Funny enough, this is actually, the method that most people rely on when they appear on podcast. Second, networking with hosts. So, you can ask for referrals, organize webinars, partner up, turn them into customers. And third, existing audience. So you can share your podcast interviews to further nurture everyone in your network. So let's break down each a little bit further. Method number 1, podcast listeners. So you can use these 3 strategies to turn your listeners into customers, brand evangelists, and subscribers. And as I mentioned, this is the method that most people actually focus on. So first of all, your introduction. And it's so important to master your introduction and just get it right. Because very often, people click to listen to your episode. And then they decide whether they want to continue after the introduction. So if you are the person who is so confident that you can wing your introduction and that you just don't need to prepare, that's awesome. Some people have this talent, but most people don't. And for that reason, you want to actually prepare at least some bullet points that you want to mention in the introduction. Make it about you, but also make it relevant to the listener. So maybe mention some of the challenges that you faced that might be relevant for the listeners as well. Second, prepare your talking points, some interesting stats, case studies, and stories to make the point. These things are very difficult to, come up with on the spot. So just make sure that you prepare them beforehand so you actually deliver more value to the audience. And lastly, call to action. So don't wait until the end. Most podcast hosts will ask you in the end, but you can give, light call to actions throughout the episode as well. So for example, one of our customers, what he was doing, he was selling a book, and he wanted to send physical copies for free to listeners of the podcast. So when he got asked a question during the podcast, he sometimes mentioned that, oh yeah, this is actually one of the topics or chapters in my book, which I can actually send you for free. Just send the word Martech to this number. Then he shared the number, and I will send it to you for free. And then he answered the question. And he generated a lot of inbound just by doing this. So podcast listeners and how to activate them for more ROI. Master your introduction, prepare your talking points, and prepare your call to action. Method number 2, host networking. So approach your podcast interview as a networking opportunity for maximum benefits. And this is so interesting because most people don't even realize that this is actually a method to monetizing their podcast appearances. The thing is, there's one guaranteed interaction that you will always have, and it's the interaction with the podcast host. So if you are prepared for that interaction, so you learn about the host, you learn about their company, and maybe you find some mutual win-wins that you could then propose. That's awesome. And we've seen that this generated a lot of money to our customers. And I would even argue that that it generated more money than podcast listeners. Because especially in B2B, you are talking with people who run businesses, who are executives in companies. So they can become your customers. They can become your referral partners. You can do some, co-marketing activities to tap into each other's audiences. So there are a lot of things that you can do, but you shouldn't be really relying only on, the listeners. So prepare for the podcast host interaction as well. And lastly, method number 3, existing audience. So share your podcast interviews to further nurture everyone in your existing network. So let's say that you create a podcast episode that is 30 minutes long. You also recorded the video. So you can create pretty much unlimited content from this one 40-minute discussion. And I'm pretty sure that the guys from Minutia know that this is the case. You can really squeeze a lot of content from a long form discussion. So this is exactly what you can do with podcast appearances as well. Now, obviously, there won't always be a video, so you can create audiograms. Or there's actually a new and sexy method that we recommend to our customers. Not all of them do it because it's a little bit more difficult, and if you're not used to it, it can be quite annoying. But you can actually have an iPhone or camera just in front of you and just record the content. Record the podcast in conversation. So you are recording your own video file on your end as you're answering the questions to the host's questions. And then you can pretty much take the recording and create content from it on your end. And host will be actually very happy because you're promoting their podcast episode. So these are 3 main methods, so your podcast listeners, host networking, and your existing audience. So here's a quick recap. Is podcast guesting the right strategy for your company. So just to recap, use this strategy if you fit the requirements. So you have realistic goal, you have proven offer, and you have clear audience definition. You're patient, so you don't need to see the results within the next 4 months. It will take much longer than 4 months, simply because that's the nature of podcasting. You need to schedule the interview, then you need to wait for the actual recording, and then it will take time before it's actually published. But once it's published, it's evergreen, so it will work for you even after you stop appearing on podcasts. But it will usually happen around month 6, month 7. You will start noticing more positive signals. And you also have resources, so you can either do this in-house or with an agency. If you do it in-house, and I think we'll be talking about it in a second with George, just make sure that it is actually quite time-consuming. So there's always some opportunity cost. We have booking agents who are handling actually very few customers, and it's their full-time job to research and to reach out to podcast hosts and draft the emails. And they also have a team of researchers and copywriters that are supporting them. So it takes actually quite a lot of effort to get that booking. Lastly, this is the 4-step process. So do this in-house or work with an agency. So targeting, just make sure that you target the right people. Then you know how to find the right podcast. So I share the method using the keywords and listennotes.com. You grab the topics. So just make sure that this actually takes a lot of your time as well, because the topics must be relevant to you and to your business, to the podcast host as well. And then the outreach. If done properly, it will take around 3 hours a day to secure 4 bookings a month. And, you need to have a strategy that's already dialed in. So just a quick expectation setting here. So that's pretty much it for today's session. And hit me up if you want to speak on podcasts. You can just message me at Jakub@speakonpodcast.com. Or if you are watching this on your screen, on your laptop, you can just take your phone out, open your camera app, and take a screenshot of this, and it will open your basically email software on your phone, and it will send the email automatically. Almost, you need to click send. Try it out; it's fun.
Jakub, that was very insightful. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, a couple of things I would like to discuss, but before that, let me just share a couple of things about our experience with speaking on podcasts. Even though like you can, if you push hard and you put enough people into like researching podcasts and reaching out to podcasts and managing communications, there is a lot of overhead in this process, obviously.
Yeah.
Still, it's a big pain. That's what I tend to realize, right? That it's a lot of work. And after doing this for a while, especially last year, I must admit that it seems to me that it's better to basically outsource the whole thing if possible, right? The only concern I have or had, let's say, when it comes to outsourcing this is, like you, I receive emails from people working on podcast booking agencies, reaching out to us to come on our own podcast. And I'm like, oh man, I wouldn't want to be represented by someone like this. I know you can speak to that, but that's one of my main concerns when it comes to outsourcing like, all this process to an agency. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, then, there are different agencies and different individuals who provide different level of service. So I was actually writing a blog post and email newsletter on this. What's the difference between, let's say, cheaper podcast booking agency and more expensive podcast booking agency? And it's usually the quality of their outreach, because simply it takes longer to write a good email. But there are service providers who will sell their services to people who maybe don't pay too much attention to their reputation, or they just don't care, about how they're being represented. So yes, like it's important to do your due diligence before about the emails that are being sent out, and how they represent you, because they're basically your quote unquote agents, right? They are out there hunting for opportunities, and you are trusting this agency or this individual to represent you in the best possible way. That interaction starts actually with the first email, not with the interview. So yeah, it takes time, and if it takes time, it usually takes more investment as well.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. But nowadays, as I mentioned, I tend to believe that it's better to just outsource it. Not having to deal with any of these things you have to do as part of the process. A couple of questions I have for you, as you were presenting the three-step process, and specifically targeting. One thing that we found also useful, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Besides, influencers and so on, we also found interesting targeting and looking for appearances of our competitors, right? Especially if we know that they are active when it comes to podcasts. I don't know if that's something you can speak about, but we had a good experience with that.
I usually ask this question as a part of the influencers question during the onboarding call. So I guide the customers to, either mention their competitors or, some other brands or individuals who are targeting the same audience they want to reach. So yes, the competitor play is definitely the right approach. But after all, you're creating the keywords, right? And it really doesn't matter whether it's competitor, influencer, as long as it will give you the right podcast. So it's really about identifying the right keywords, and what we are discussing are different subcategories of keywords.
That makes sense. And another thing, once again, part of this three-step process on how to search for podcasts, I would like to know whether you have any criteria. I mean, you kind of touched on that when you mentioned your podcast and the fact that it was inactive for 2 years when that person reached out, that agent from that podcast booking agency. But are any other criteria that you are looking for and using when evaluating podcast opportunities for your customers?
So we have, I think, around 8 things that the podcast must match before we actually include it in the outreach batch. I don't have them all on top of my mind, but there is like the number of episodes. So if it's less than a certain number, I'm not now entirely sure what the number is, as I'm not so hands-on in the process anymore. Then we don't reach out, because it probably means that the podcast is inactive. Then the frequency of posting, so we want to see some regular posting schedule. Previous guests, so if the guests are relevant to the customer that we are representing. Then the overall audio quality, and whether it's like a show that I would like to appear on. But the thing is, and we also check, the ratings on Apple, iTunes, in different geographies like UK, US, Canada, and so on. But the thing is that there is not a single metric that you could look into in isolation and say this is a good podcast. So you need to basically work with many different metrics and ranking mechanisms to figure out whether this podcast is the right fit for you. So, if you would be only looking at the number of downloads, you would see 200, you would say too low. But if the previous guests were CEO of Google, Elon Musk, and it was a new podcast, so there are maybe 3 episodes, but for some reason the host is so well connected that he gets really interesting guests, is it a good podcast for you to appear on? Probably yes, because you will build tons of brand by association. So it's always important to check the podcast, the overall picture. Don't look at one metric in isolation. and basically then follow your gut feeling and just answer, like, is this not necessarily worth my time, but will I really enjoy it?
That's a good point. One thing I would like to share based on our experience with hosting our podcast and receiving these emails, and I don't know if you had any experiences with what I'm about to share, is that one time we accepted, I think this was the only time, we accepted a person who came on the podcast, and like he was a guest on our podcast, but the only caveat was that, you know, we told the like person who reached out to us from the podcast booking agency that we are going to have them as a guest, but only if we do something with their brand, because it happened that we knew their brand and they had it was a very well respected brand in their let's say industry, and they had a webinar series, and so, you know, we kind of exchanged a couple of emails, and what they got was a podcast appearance, and what we got was a webinar with them, right? So what I'm trying to say, I guess, long story very short, if you have something to offer, that could also, in exchange of getting on the podcast, that could also work as an extra incentive for,
yes,
you know, the person on the other end to say, okay, yeah, let's do it.
There are definitely some things that you can use in the outreach that will make it easier for hosts to accept you as a guest. But first always comes relevancy, right? So is this guest relevant for the podcast? And then you should be thinking about the things you can use to increase the chances of being actually accepted. So some of these things can be high engagement on the guest's social media profiles. So you can say that, okay, after I appear on this podcast, I will then promote it on LinkedIn, where I have 50,000 connections, and usually I get around 300 likes per post. So it will, bring a lot of people into your network. Or maybe you have an email newsletter. So you can mention that I will share it with 4,000 email subscribers once the episode goes live. Maybe you do something like webinar series, or maybe you have your own podcast that you could invite the host on to be a guest. So always think about these like deal sweeteners that you can throw in to increase the chances of actually getting accepted.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I had in mind. Okay, I don't see any questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I guess we can wrap things up. This was all very insightful. Jakub, I would like to thank you very much for doing this, for preparing such a great presentation and coming on. We will share the recording with all the people who signed up for this. And we will also share the slides, I guess, who present your thought process and like the steps that you shared with us. Last question I have for you before we go: where can people find out more and reach out or get in touch if they'd like to?
So if you want to learn more about our agency, you can go to speakonpodcasts.com. That's speakonpodcasts.com. And if you want to reach out to me directly, you can reach out to me at Jakub, Jakub, at speakonpodcasts.com, or find me on LinkedIn. Now, don't get confused on LinkedIn. I post about different things, but you will see that, you will still find Speak on Podcast there in my profile. So it's either LinkedIn, just search for my name, or Jakub at speakonpodcasts.com.
That's great. Jakub, thank you very much for doing this, and have a great afternoon or night, depending on what time is it there.
6:45 p.m.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.